10-year-old boy disappeared at an amusement park. All efforts by his parents and the police to find him proved futile, but 15 years later, his voice was heard on a radio station. For the past decade, Wonderland had been the epicenter of summer fun, drawing families from all over the region for its annual Summerfest celebration. The park was abuzz with excitement as families poured in, their faces aglow with anticipation. Among them was 10-year-old Jack, his eyes shining like stars as he clutched his favorite stuffed animal, Mr. Whiskers, tightly in his arms. Jack had been waiting for this day for what felt like forever, and his enthusiasm was palpable. As Jack and his family made their way through the park's entrance, the cacophony of laughter, screams of delight, and the rumble of roller coasters enveloped them, instantly transporting Jack to a world of pure joy. He tugged at his parents' hands, his face alight with an irrepressible grin as he begged to go on the tilt-a-whirl first. His parents, Mark and Sarah, exchanged a knowing glance, and with a chuckle, they let Jack lead the way. The day was a whirlwind of color and sound, with Jack's infectious laughter echoing through the park as he rode the Ferris wheel, played games, and devoured his weight in sugary treats. As the sun began to set, casting a warm orange glow over Wonderland, Jack's parents suggested they head for the park's iconic roller coaster, the Thunderbolt, for one final ride before the night drew to a close. Jack's eyes sparkled with excitement as he nodded vigorously, already racing ahead to join the queue. In this moment, as the family waited in line for the Thunderbolt, the world seemed perfect. The sky was painted with hues of pink and gold. The air was filled with the sweet scent of summer, and Jack's laughter was music to his parents' ears. Little did they know, this perfect day would soon take a dramatic turn, one that would change their lives forever. As the night wore on, the crowds at Wonderland grew thicker, the throngs of people swarming around the attractions like a tide of humanity. Jack's parents, Mark and Sarah, had been keeping a close eye on him, but in the chaos of the crowd, they momentarily lost sight of their son. At first, they thought nothing of it, assuming Jack was simply exploring or waiting for them a few feet away. But as the minutes ticked by and Jack failed to reappear, a growing sense of unease began to creep over Mark and Sarah. They scanned the crowd frantically, their eyes scouring the sea of faces for any sign of their son's familiar grin. The sounds of laughter and music still filled the air, but to Mark and Sarah, the atmosphere had suddenly turned sinister. Jack, where are you?" Sarah called out, her voice rising above the din of the crowd. Mark joined in, his deep voice booming through the noise. "Jack, answer us." But there was only silence. Panic began to set in as Mark and Sarah frantically searched the surrounding area. They checked the ride they had just gotten off, the games, and the food stalls, but Jack was nowhere to be found. The couple exchanged worried glances, their hearts racing with fear. They had been so caught up in the excitement of the night that they had let their guard down, and now their son was gone. As the reality of the situation began to sink in, Mark and Sarah's calls for help grew more desperate. They approached a park employee, who quickly radioed for assistance. Within minutes, the park security team was mobilized and a search party was formed. Mark and Sarah were beside themselves, their minds racing with worst-case scenarios. The police were called, and soon, officers in uniform were combing the park, questioning witnesses, and reviewing security footage. The investigation had begun, and Mark and Sarah were left to pace anxiously, their hopes pinned on finding Jack safe and sound. The night that had started with so much joy had turned into a nightmare, and the search for Jack had only just begun. As the hours ticked by, the police investigation into Jack's disappearance intensified. Detectives pored over security footage, interviewed witnesses, and scoured the park for any sign of the missing boy. Mark and Sarah were beside themselves, providing every detail of their son's last moments, no matter how small. They waited anxiously for any news, their hearts heavy with worry. Weeks turned into a blur of sleepless nights and endless searches. The community rallied around Jack's family, with volunteers distributing flyers, searching the woods surrounding Wonderland, and offering words of encouragement. Local businesses displayed posters of Jack's smiling face in their windows, and the town's residents held candlelight vigils, praying for his safe return. Despite the efforts, the investigation yielded no concrete leads. The police followed up on every tip, every rumor, and every potential sighting, but none panned out. As the days turned into weeks, the initial optimism began to fade. The community's enthusiasm waned, and the media's attention shifted elsewhere. Mark and Sarah's hope began to dwindle, replaced by a growing sense of despair. They couldn't bear the thought of living without their son, and the uncertainty was eating away at them. The police continued to investigate, but the lack of progress was taking its toll. As the weeks turned into months, the police investigation slowly wound down. The case remained open, but the resources dedicated to it began to dwindle. Mark and Sarah were heartbroken, feeling like they were losing their fight to find their son. The police eventually made the difficult decision to close the case, citing a lack of evidence and leads. The news hit Mark and Sarah like a ton of bricks. They felt like they were losing all hope, and the reality of their situation began to sink in. Their son was gone, and they might never see him again. The community's support began to fade, and the town slowly returned to its normal routine. Mark and Sarah were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, forever changed by the disappearance of their beloved son, Jack. The silence that followed was deafening, a constant reminder of what they had lost. 15 years had passed since Jack's disappearance, yet the wound still felt fresh for Mark. He had never married again, dedicating his life to searching for his son, scouring the internet for any hint of Jack's whereabouts, and holding on to memories of their time together. His friends and family had long since given up hope, but Mark couldn't bring himself to do the same. Sarah, on the other hand, had tried to move on. She had remarried a kind man named Tom, and they had built a life together. But the pain of losing Jack had left its mark, and she often found herself thinking about what could have been. She and Mark had drifted apart over the years, their shared grief driving them to different coping mechanisms. As the town of Riverview Heights prepared to celebrate the reopening of Wonderland, a sense of nostalgia washed over the community. The park had been closed for renovations following a devastating storm, but now it was back, bigger and better than ever. WCRK, the local radio station, was hosting a live broadcast from the park's reopening celebration. The DJ, Rachel, was known for her infectious energy, and she was thrilled to be hosting the event. As the sun began to set on Wonderland, the crowd gathered around the stage, eager to hear Rachel's broadcast. Mark stood at the edge of the crowd, his eyes fixed on the park's entrance. He hadn't been back since the day Jack disappeared, and the memories came flooding back. Sarah, on the other hand, was at home with her new family, trying to avoid the painful reminders of the past. The broadcast began, and Rachel's voice filled the airwaves, chatting with the park's management and interviewing visitors. The atmosphere was lively, with music and laughter filling the air. Little did anyone know, this night would be one that would change everything. The anticipation was palpable as Rachel announced the final segment of the broadcast, and the crowd cheered in anticipation. But just as Rachel was about to sign off, something unexpected happened. As Rachel wrapped up the final segment of the broadcast, she paused for a moment before signing off. Suddenly, the studio's equipment crackled to life, and a hesitant voice spoke into the microphone. "Hello?" the voice said, sounding uncertain. Rachel's eyes widened in surprise as she turned to her producer. "Who is this?" she mouthed. The voice spoke again, this time more confidently. "It's me, Jack." The studio fell silent. Rachel's eyes locked onto the producer, who was frantically signaling for her to keep the caller on the line. "Jack who?" Rachel asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The voice hesitated before responding. "Jack, from Wonderland. I used to go to the park with my parents. My name is Jack." Rachel's eyes widened as she realized the significance of the caller's words. She glanced at her producer, who was now frantically searching for information on the park's former visitors. "Jack, can you tell me more about yourself?" Rachel asked, her voice filled with a mix of curiosity and caution. The voice on the other end hesitated again before speaking. I don't know if I should. I just wanted to see if anyone would recognize me." As the voice spoke, Mark, who was listening to the broadcast in his car, felt his heart skip a beat. He pulled over to the side of the road, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. "Could it be?" he whispered to himself. Meanwhile, Sarah was at home, listening to the broadcast with her husband, Tom. She had been drifting in and out of attention, But when she heard the voice, she sat up straight. "Tom, do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom looked at her with concern. "Hear what, honey?" Sarah's eyes were fixed on the radio. The voice. It sounds like Jack." As the mysterious voice continued to speak, the studio crew was in a frenzy, trying to verify the caller's identity. Rachel was torn between excitement and skepticism, unsure of what to make of the claim. The voice, however, seemed genuine, its tone filled with a deep longing and uncertainty. As the broadcast continued, the mystery deepened, leaving listeners wondering, was this really Jack, or was it just a cruel prank? The truth, it seemed, was about to unfold in ways no one could have anticipated. As the mysterious voice continued to speak on the radio, the studio crew sprang into action. Rachel's producer quickly contacted the police, and soon, detectives arrived at the studio to investigate the claim. The police were intrigued by the voice's words, and they began to scrutinize the call. They asked Rachel to try and keep the caller on the line, hoping to gather more information. The voice, however, seemed hesitant to reveal too much, and the conversation was carefully managed to avoid scaring the caller away. Meanwhile, Jack's family was in an uproar. Mark was convinced that the voice was his son's, and he couldn't believe that he might finally have a lead after all these years. Sarah, on the other hand, was more skeptical. She wanted to believe that it was Jack, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it might be a prank. As the news spread, the radio hosts at WCRK became increasingly intrigued. Rachel and her producer, Alex, decided to investigate further, working with the police to uncover the truth behind the mysterious voice. They pored over old records and interviewed people who had been at the park on the day Jack disappeared. The investigation was heating up, and the stakes were high. If this was indeed Jack, it would be a miracle. But if it was a prank, it would be a cruel one. The police and the radio hosts worked tirelessly to uncover the truth, and Jack's family held their breath, torn between hope and skepticism. As the hours ticked by, the tension built. Would they be able to uncover the truth behind the mysterious voice, or would it remain a mystery forever? The investigation had just begun, and already, it was clear that this was going to be a complex and emotional case. The police were determined to get to the bottom of it, and the radio hosts were eager to share the story with the world. But as they dug deeper, they realized that the truth might be more complicated than they had initially thought. The voice on the radio had sparked a chain of events that would change everything. As the investigation continued, Rachel and Alex at WCRK decided to dig deeper into the case. They started by interviewing former Wonderland employees who had worked at the park during Summerfest 15 years ago. They also spoke to people who had been visitors to the park on that fateful day, hoping to gather more information about Jack's disappearance. One of the first people they interviewed was a former park employee named Eddie. Eddie had worked at Wonderland for over 10 years and had been a ride operator on the day Jack disappeared. Rachel and Alex met with Eddie at a local coffee shop, and he seemed nervous and fidgety as they asked him questions. "I don't know what you're talking about," Eddie said, when Rachel mentioned the mysterious voice on the radio. "I haven't worked at Wonderland in years." Rachel and Alex exchanged a glance. Something about Eddie's demeanor didn't seem right. They pressed him for more information, but he insisted that he knew nothing about Jack's disappearance. As they continued their investigation, they discovered that Eddie had a questionable past. He had been fired from Wonderland several years ago after allegations of misconduct. Rachel and Alex wondered if Eddie might be more involved in Jack's disappearance than he was letting on. Their next lead took them to a former park visitor named Samantha. Samantha had been at Wonderland during Summerfest 15 years ago, and she had vivid memories of the day. She told Rachel and Alex that she had seen a suspicious person lurking around the park that day, but she hadn't thought much of it at the time. "I remember seeing a guy who seemed out of place," Samantha said. "He was wearing a black hoodie and sunglasses, and he seemed really nervous. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now I wonder if it might have been important." Rachel and Alex thanked Samantha for her time and continued their investigation. They were starting to piece together a timeline of events, and they were getting closer to uncovering the truth about Jack's disappearance. As they dug deeper, they discovered more clues and potential suspects. They interviewed former park employees, visitors, and even people who had been in the area on the day Jack disappeared. The investigation was heating up, and Rachel and Alex were determined to get to the bottom of it. But just as they thought they were making progress, they received a cryptic message that threw everything into chaos. The message was from an unknown number, and it read, "You're getting close. Back off now." Rachel and Alex exchanged a nervous glance. Who was behind the message, and what did they want? As the investigation into Jack's disappearance continued, more questions arose than answers. The police and the radio hosts at WCRK were working tirelessly to uncover the truth, but every lead seemed to end in a dead end. Just when they thought they were making progress, the mysterious voice appeared again on the radio. Rachel and Alex were broadcasting live, and the voice came on the air, providing cryptic clues and hints. "I remember the Ferris wheel," the voice said, its tone melancholic. "I remember the smell of funnel cakes and cotton candy, but I don't remember how I got there." Rachel and Alex exchanged a glance, their eyes locked in a mixture of fascination and concern. They asked the voice to elaborate, but it remained tight-lipped, providing only vague hints. Jack's family was torn between hope and despair. Mark was convinced that the voice was his son's, and he couldn't bear the thought of living without knowing the truth. Sarah, on the other hand, was more cautious, unsure if the voice was genuine or just a cruel prank. As the broadcast continued, the voice dropped more hints, each one sparking a flurry of speculation and investigation. The police and the radio hosts worked around the clock, trying to piece together the fragments of information. But the more they learned, the more questions they had. Who was behind the mysterious voice? What did they know about Jack's disappearance? And what did they want from the family? The investigation was like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Every time they thought they had a breakthrough, another piece would disappear, leaving them with more questions than answers. As the days went by, Jack's family became increasingly desperate. They wanted answers, but the mysterious voice seemed to be playing a cat-and-mouse game with them. Mark was on the verge of losing hope, while Sarah was trying to hold on to the possibility that their son might still be alive. The radio hosts at WCRK were also feeling the pressure. They were under scrutiny from their listeners and the police, who were questioning their decision to broadcast the mysterious voice. Rachel and Alex knew they had to tread carefully, but they were determined to get to the bottom of the story. As the investigation continued, the tension built. The mysterious voice was still out there, and they knew they had to be careful. But they were determined to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. The investigation was a complex web of clues, hints, and speculation. But one thing was certain: the truth would eventually come out, and when it did, it would change everything. As the investigation into the mysterious voice continued, Rachel and Alex at WCRK stumbled upon a shocking twist. While digging through the station's emails, they discovered a series of eerie messages that had been sent to the production team. The messages were cryptic and unsettling, mentioning specific details about the broadcast and the investigation. They were sent from an unknown email address, and the tone was always cold and calculating. Rachel's eyes widened as she read through the messages. "This is freaking me out," she whispered to Alex. "Who is doing this?" Alex's face was pale. "I don't know, but I think we're dealing with something more sinister than a prank." As they continued to investigate, they realized that the mysterious voice on the radio was not just claiming to be Jack, but it was also behind these creepy messages. The team was shocked and unnerved, unsure of what to make of the new information. The police were called in, and they began to investigate the source of the messages. They worked with the station's IT team to track down the IP address, but it seemed to be coming from a secure server. The team at WCRK was on edge, unsure of what would happen next. They had been investigating a possible prank, but now it seemed like something more sinister was at play. As the news spread, Jack's family was even more anxious. They had been hoping for answers, but now they were faced with the possibility that something more complex and disturbing was going on. Mark's eyes were fixed on the radio, his mind racing with questions. Who was behind the mysterious voice? What did they want? And why were they sending creepy messages to the station? Sarah was trying to stay calm, but she couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. She kept thinking about the investigation and the mysterious voice, wondering what would happen next. The team at WCRK was determined to get to the bottom of the story, but they knew they had to be careful. They were dealing with something that seemed more sinister than a simple prank, and they didn't know what would happen next. As the investigation continued, the tension built. The mysterious voice was still out there, and the team knew they had to be careful. The twist had changed everything. and the team knew they had to approach the investigation with caution. They were no longer dealing with a simple prank, but something more complex and potentially sinister. The question on everyone's mind was, what would happen next? Would they uncover the truth behind the mysterious voice, or would it remain a mystery forever? The investigation was far from over, and the team knew they had to be prepared for anything. The final confrontation was intense. Rachel, Alex, and the police had been tracking down the suspect for hours, and finally, they had him cornered. The suspect, a man in his mid-40s, was sitting in a dimly lit room, his eyes darting back and forth between the investigators. "Who are you?" Rachel demanded, her voice firm but controlled. The man smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "My name is Dr. Lee," he said. "I'm a psychologist, and I've been studying the effects of trauma on the human mind for years." The investigators exchanged a glance, confused. "What does this have to do with Jack's disappearance?" Alex asked. Dr. Lee leaned forward, his eyes glinting with a sinister light. "Jack was one of my subjects," he said. "I was studying the effects of trauma on his mind, and I used various methods to manipulate his memories and perceptions." The room fell silent, the investigators stunned by the revelation. Jack's family was shocked, their minds reeling with the implications. "What do you mean?" Mark demanded, his voice shaking with anger. "What did you do to our son?" Dr. Lee leaned back in his chair, a smug expression on his face. "I used hypnosis, suggestion, and manipulation to alter Jack's memories," he said. "I wanted to see if I could create a false narrative in his mind, one that would be indistinguishable from reality." The investigators were horrified. They had never suspected that Jack's disappearance was part of a twisted experiment. "Why?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do such a thing?" Dr. Lee shrugged, his expression devoid of remorse. "I wanted to advance the field of psychology," he said. "I wanted to understand the human mind, and I was willing to do whatever it took to get the answers I sought." The investigators were stunned, their minds reeling with the implications. They had uncovered a dark secret, one that would change everything. As the truth came out, Jack's family finally got the answers they had been searching for. They learned that Jack had been a subject in Dr. Lee's unauthorized experiment, and that his memories had been deliberately manipulated, his identity stolen, reshaped, and hidden beneath a fog of synthetic memories and implanted lies. The mysterious voice on the radio had been Jack himself, finally breaking free from Dr. Lee's control. His fragmented thoughts had reached out through the airwaves, desperately trying to reconnect with the family he could barely remember. The final confrontation was intense, raw with emotion, but it brought long overdue closure. For years, Mark and Sarah had lived in limbo, unsure if their son was alive or dead, if he had run away or met a cruel fate. Now they knew the truth, and while the truth was painful, it gave them something priceless, a path forward. In a courtroom packed with journalists, psychologists, and grieving parents, Dr. Lee was sentenced to 75 years in federal prison for the 15 years he stole from Jack's youth. The judge's words were sharp and clear. "You sought to decode the human mind by tearing it apart, but you forgot the most vital principle in science and humanity, consent. You didn't just take Jack's memories, you took his life." Dr. Lee showed no emotion as he was led away in handcuffs. But the courtroom erupted in silence. Not relief, not celebration, but solemn recognition. Justice, imperfect though it may be, had finally been served. In the aftermath, Jack's family tried to come to terms with the weight of all they had learned. In their living room, surrounded by old photographs and fading childhood toys, Mark and Sarah sat with Jack, now a quiet, withdrawn young man, trying to reconnect. There were good days and bad, moments of lucidity, moments of breakdown. But they were a family again, even though Sarah had built another one in the absence of Jack. "We'll take it one day at a time," Sarah whispered as she gently brushed his hair back from his eyes. "No more experiments. Just love. Just us." The radio station WCRK became a symbol of resilience in the community. Rachel and Alex, the hosts who had risked everything to air Jack's voice and chase the truth, were recognized for their courage. But even they struggled with the moral weight of the story. "It's a story that will stay with us forever," Rachel said. "It's a reminder of what happens when science loses its soul." Alex nodded. "We thought we were chasing a mystery, but what we uncovered was something deeper, a truth about how fragile identity is and how powerful love can be. As the weeks turned into months, and months into years, the town slowly began to heal. Memorials were not built from stone, but from conversations, from changed laws, from renewed emphasis on ethics in scientific research. Schools taught Jack's story as a case study. Universities overhauled their research protocols. Something terrible had happened, but something better was growing from its ashes. Jack, though forever changed, began to find peace. With therapy, support, and his parents' unwavering love, he began to reclaim small pieces of himself. His love for drawing, his fondness for thunderstorms, his old favorite songs. Though the full truth of his lost years might never be recovered, he began to build new memories, real ones. Yet one haunting question would always remain, lingering like an echo. What had he seen in those years of captivity? What had he become while under Dr. Lee's control? The answer might never be known, but perhaps it didn't need to be, because Jack was home, and that was enough.